The trucks arrived before the sun did. Marlene Hutchins heard them before she saw them, a low, grinding rumble that rolled up through the floorboards of the farmhouse and into the soreness of her feet. She had lived on this land for 38 years, long enough to know every sound a morning could make. The creak of the barn door, the huff of cattle shifting in their stalls, the particular hiss of the milking line, pressurizing at 4:45 a.m., like clockwork, every single day since she was a girl. This sound was different. This sound didn't belong. She pulled on her boots, without lacing them, and stepped out onto the porch, just as the first headlights swept across the gravel drive. Not one truck, two diesel engines idling in the cold, exhaust curling up into air still holding the last of the night's chill. Behind them, a haze of dust hung suspended in the beam of their headlights, catching the grey light of a sun that hadn't yet decided to rise. She stood there for a moment, arms crossed over her flannel shirt, waiting for her mind to catch up with what her eyes were telling her. These weren't the co-op's trucks. She knew every truck that had ever come up this driveway, knew their engines by sound alone, the way a mother knows her children's footsteps on the stairs. These trucks were strangers. Men climbed down from the cabs. They moved with the brisk, unbothered efficiency of people executing a checklist, not people arriving with news. One of them carried a clipboard. Another unhooked chains from the side of the larger truck, the ones used for hauling heavy equipment. Ma'am, the one with the clipboard didn't quite meet her eyes. We're here for the tank and the line equipment. Compressor too, if it's still under the lease. Marlene didn't answer right away. She was doing the math in her head, the kind of math a person does when the ground is shifting and they're trying to find something solid to stand on. The bulk tank, the pipeline milker, the compressor that kept it all running. These weren't just machines. They were the dairy's circulatory system. Take them, and the whole operation stopped breathing. There's been some mistake, she finally said, though even as the words left her mouth, she already knew there hadn't been. There hadn't been a mistake. There'd been a letter 6 weeks ago. That she'd read once and folded back into its envelope and put in the drawer beneath the phone. The way you might put away a diagnosis you weren't ready to face. There had been phone calls she hadn't returned. There had been a silence she had mistaken, foolishly, for time.
The workers moved past her into the milking parlor. She followed, feeling like a visitor in her own barn, watching hands she didn't recognize disconnect hoses her father had once repaired with baling wire and stubbornness. Within an hour, the stainless bulk tank, the one that had cooled 40 years of Hutchins milk, was chained to the flatbed, rocking gently as the truck pulled it free of the concrete pad where it had sat since before Marlene was born. What they didn't take, because nobody wanted it anymore, was older still rows of stainless steel milk cans, some dented, some so old they still bore the hand-stamped initials of Marlene's grandfather, stacked 3 deep along the barn wall where they'd been retired to make room for the bulk tank decades ago. Relics, leftovers, from an era before refrigerated trucks and pipeline milkers, back when farmers hauled 10-gallon cans to the creamery by horse, cart, and later by pickup truck. The workers stepped around them like they were stepping around scrap nobody had gotten to yet. In a way, they were right. By mid-morning, the second truck was loaded with the compressor, coils of copper tubing, and the automated feed system her husband had financed 3 years earlier, back when a loan still felt like an investment instead of a noose. The men worked fast, said little, and by the time the sun had fully cleared the tree line, they were gone, taillights disappearing down the county road in a trail of dust, leaving behind a barn that echoed instead of hummed. Marlene stood in the doorway for a long time after the sound of the engines faded. She thought about her grandmother, who used to say that a working dairy never goes quiet. There's always a compressor humming, a cow lowing, a bucket clanging somewhere. Now, there was nothing. Just wind moving through an open door, and the faint, sour smell of spilled milk drying on concrete where a hose had been disconnected too fast. She walked to the wall of old milk cans and put her hand on the cold metal of the nearest one. It had been her great-grandfather's. She was almost certain the initials were worn nearly smooth, but she could still make out the shape of them if the light hit right. By sunset, nearly everything her family had built over 3 generations would be gone. Only the old milk cans remained. To understand what was lost that morning, you have to go back further than the trucks. You have to go back to 1962, to a young couple named Walter and Ada Hutchins, who bought 60 acres of hill country with a down payment scraped together from Walter's years in the army and Ada's job at a feed store. They didn't buy the land because it was easy ground for dairying. It wasn't. Not really. All slopes and stone, but because it was theirs. And in Walter's mind, that made all the difference. The dairy started small, cows, a hand-crank separator, and a battered truck that Walter used to haul cans of milk to the creamery 3 miles down the county road. Ada kept the books at the kitchen table by lamplight, and when the milk check came in each month, she'd set aside a little in a coffee can before anything else got spent. A habit she called paying the farm first, and one she taught to her son, and eventually to her granddaughter, Marlene. Marlene grew up inside that rhythm. She remembered being 5 years old, sitting on an overturned bucket in the milking parlor while her grandfather worked, watching the way his hands moved without hesitation, the way he talked low and steady to the cows, like they were old friends catching up. She remembered the particular clatter of milk cans being loaded onto the truck bed before dawn, a sound that, to a child, meant the day had officially begun, the same way a rooster's crow might mean it for someone else. By the time Marlene was old enough to help for real, the dairy had grown to 40 head, then 80. The old creamery cans gave way to a bulk tank in the late 1970s, but her grandfather never got rid of the old cans. He lined them up along the barn wall instead, a quiet museum of everything the farm had been before. You don't throw away where you came from, he told her once, even when you've outgrown it. Marlene absorbed the whole shape of the work the way children absorb the things that surround them, not as lessons, but as simply how the world was. Up at 4, milking by hand until her arms burned, then by machine once the equipment came. Hay in summer, ice on the water troughs in winter, 4-H in the fall, county fair ribbons pinned to the refrigerator. Her mother's hands, cracked and strong, kneading bread on Sunday mornings after the milking was done and before church. She remembered the community, to the neighboring farms that would trade equipment and labor during calving season, the creamery route driver who knew every family by name and always had a peppermint for the kids who rode along the way. The whole valley seemed to organize itself around the rhythm of milk trucks coming and going. The cans, back then, weren't sentimental objects. They were simply the vessels that carried a family's work out into the world and brought back, in return, just enough to keep going. When Marlene took over the dairy in her late 20s, after her father's heart gave out sooner than anyone expected, she inherited more than land and cattle. She inherited an idea of what a dairy was supposed to mean, a covenant between a family and a piece of ground, honored generation after generation through. Nothing more complicated than showing up every single day, no matter the weather or the price of milk. For a long time, that was enough. But somewhere in the years that followed, quietly, the way most disasters actually arrive, the numbers started working against her. Milk prices that had once moved in a farmer's favor as often as not, began drifting downward, year after year. No matter how hard she worked or how efficiently she ran things, feed costs climbed. Equipment that used to last 15 years now needed replacing in 8. And each new machine came with a payment book instead of a bill of sale. The processors who used to send trucks up every small dairy road in the county began consolidating their pickup routes, favoring the larger operations that could fill a tanker in one stop instead of 6. Marlene kept the books the way her grandmother had taught her, carefully, honestly, with a coffee can's worth of hope tucked into every entry. But by the time the letter arrived, the coffee can had been empty for a long time, and the debt behind it had grown into something that couldn't be paid down with hard work alone. She hadn't seen the end coming, so much as she'd seen it coming for years and kept believing, the way farmers do, that one more good season would turn it around. It never did. The truth, when Marlene finally let herself look at it squarely, wasn't a single event. It was an accumulation, the slow arithmetic of 100 small pressures, compounding over more than a decade until the dairy simply couldn't outrun them anymore. It started with price. Milk, unlike almost anything else a farmer produces, doesn't get priced by the farmer at all. It gets priced by federal formulas and regional markets that respond to global supply, to what's happening with powdered milk exports on the other side of the planet, to decisions made in boardrooms Marlene would never see. In good years, the price covered the cost of production with a little left over. In bad years, and there had been more bad years than good, especially in the last decade, the price fell below what it cost her just to keep the cows fed and the barn running. She was, in effect, losing money on every gallon she shipped, and making it up only in volume, which meant working harder for less, a treadmill with no exit ramp. Then came consolidation. The regional creamery that had bought the Hutchins milk since Walter's Day was purchased by a national processor in a wave of industry buyouts that swept through dairy country. The new company didn't send trucks up every small farm road anymore. It was cheaper for them to contract with a handful of massive operations that could fill an entire tanker truck from a single farm. Small producers like Marlene were offered contracts with lower prices, shorter notice, and no guarantee of renewal. She signed what she was given because the alternative was no contract at all. regulation added its own weight. Not because the rules were unreasonable on their own, but because meeting them required capital she didn't have. New water quality standards meant upgrading her manure management system. Updated food safety requirements meant her aging milking parlor no longer passed inspection without renovations. Each requirement made sense in isolation, protecting water, protecting food safety, but each one also came with an invoice, and the invoices arrived faster than the milk checks could cover them. She took out loans, first for the parlor upgrade, then for a new bulk tank when the old one finally failed a pressure test, then, in what she would later recognize as the beginning of the true unraveling, for an automated feeding system a sales rep convinced her would cut her labor costs enough to justify the payment. It did cut her labor costs, it just never cut them by enough. By the time the drought hit too dry, summers back to back, that drove hay prices to levels she'd never seen. The dairy was already running on borrowed time and borrowed money in equal measure. She sold off young stock to make a loan payment. She skipped equipment maintenance that should have happened. She stopped taking a paycheck for herself, quietly, without telling anyone, and simply let the farm eat whatever came in. The letter that arrived 6 weeks before the trucks was from the equipment finance company, not the bank. A lease default notice on the compressor and pipeline system, triggered after 2 missed payments turned into 4, buried in the fine print of a contract Marlene had signed years earlier, back when the equipment felt like an investment in the future rather than a countdown clock, was a repossession clause. When she didn't respond, the company exercised it. The trucks that came for her weren't sent by some faceless villain twirling a mustache over her ruin. They were sent by a finance company collecting on a contract, executing paperwork with the same detachment a person might use to close out any overdue account. In their eyes, this wasn't a family's legacy being dismantled. It was an asset recovery. What they left behind told its own story. The stainless bulk tank, the compressor, the pipeline system, the automated feeder, all of it modern, all of it financed, all of it gone within a single morning. What remained were the things too old, too outdated, too worthless in a resale market to be worth hauling away. A broken tractor with a cracked block, a hay rake missing a wheel, and along the barn wall, stacked 3 deep and gathering dust, more than 200 stainless steel milk cans that hadn't held a drop of milk in 40 years. Nobody wanted them. That was the whole point. They were left behind precisely because they had no value to anyone who was only counting dollars. In the weeks that followed, Marlene tried everything a person tries when the ground gives way beneath something they've spent their whole life building. She called the bank first, sitting at the same kitchen table where her grandmother once kept the books, trying to explain a situation that didn't have a tidy explanation. The loan officer was polite, even sympathetic, but the numbers didn't move, no matter how the conversation went. Without the equipment, there was no way to produce milk. And without milk, there was no income to service what remained of the debt. She looked into selling the land outright, just to clear what she owed and walk away with something. But the offers that came in were from developers eyeing the hillside for something other than cows, and every one of them made her stomach turn. She looked for outside work, driving 40 minutes each way to sit through an interview for a bookkeeping position at a farm supply store, a job that would have paid a fraction of what the dairy used to bring in during its better years. She got the job. She quit after 3 weeks, not because the work was hard, but because every day she spent behind that register felt like abandoning a promise she'd made without ever saying the words out loud. A promise to Walter, to Ada, to her father, to keep the place going. She tried, in her own quiet way, to save what she could of the physical farm itself. She patched the barn roof where it had started to sag. She kept the fence lines mended even though there was no livestock left to contain. She mowed the front pasture on schedule, as if maintaining the appearance of a working dairy might somehow will it back into existence. None of it changed the fact that the barn, when she stepped inside it now, held nothing but silence. That silence was the hardest part. She had spent her whole life inside a building that was never actually quiet. Always the low mechanical hum of the compressor, the shuffle and low of cattle, the clank of equipment, voices calling back and forth during morning chores. Now, when she pushed open the barn door, there was nothing. No cows, no sounds, just dust moving lazily in shafts of afternoon light. And along the far wall, hundreds of milk cans standing in silent rows, waiting for a purpose nobody could name. She started going into the barn less. It was easier not to look at what was gone. But there was one afternoon, she would remember it later as the turning point, though it didn't feel like one at the time, when she went in anyway, mostly out of habit, and found herself standing in front of the cans instead of walking past them. She ran her hand along the dented side of one, feeling the raised seam where the metal had been hand soldered generations ago. She noticed, for the first time in years, the different shapes among them, some 10-gallon, some smaller, some with lids still intact, some rusted through at the bottom, some bearing the faint painted numbers of a creamery route long out of business. Everyone else who had walked through that barn in the past 6 weeks, the finance company's workers, the appraiser who'd come to assess what little remained, even a scrap dealer she'd called out of desperation to see what the metal might be worth, had looked at those cans and seen exactly one thing: junk. Worthless leftovers. Worth pennies a pound if she was lucky enough to find a buyer. Marlene stood there a long moment, her hand resting on cold, dented steel that had outlived a bulk tank, an automated feeder, and a dairy business built by 3 generations of her family. Everyone else saw scrap metal. She couldn't stop seeing possibility. It didn't happen all at once. There was no lightning bolt of inspiration, no single moment where the whole plan revealed itself fully formed. It started small, almost accidentally, the way most real changes do. A few weeks after that afternoon in the barn, Marlene drove into town for groceries and passed a farmhouse-style cafe that had opened on Main Street, the kind of place with reclaimed wood tables and mason jar light fixtures, catering to a crowd that had never milked a cow in their life, but loved the aesthetic of having done so. Sitting just inside the front window, holding a cluster of dried flowers, was an old milk can, not unlike the one stacked in her barn. A small, hand-lettered sign nearby read, "Vintage dairy can, restored $145. Marlene stood on the sidewalk longer than she meant to, doing the math without quite meaning to do it. She had 200 of those in her barn. Nobody had wanted to pay her scrap price for the whole lot. That night, she didn't sleep much. She sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the same table where Ada once kept the farm's books, and started writing down everything she remembered about the cans. Not their monetary worth, but their story. Hand-soldered seams, decades of use, initials worn into the metal by her grandfather's hands. She didn't know yet what she was building, only that she'd stumbled onto something worth paying attention to. The next weekend, she pulled one can out of the barn, one of the better preserved ones, dented but solid, and set to work. She didn't have any special training in metal restoration. What she had was patience, a wire brush, a bucket of soapy water, and hours of quiet time that the farm's silence had left her with in abundance. She scrubbed away decades of grime, sanded down the worst of the rust, and left the dents in the faded paint mostly as they were, sensing correctly, though she couldn't have explained why at the time, that the imperfections were part of what made the thing worth looking at. She posted a photo in a local buy and sell group online, almost as an afterthought, along with a short caption: "Original dairy milk can from a family farm in the valley. 3 generations, hand restored. $85. It sold in 4 hours. The buyer, a woman decorating a farmhouse-style wedding venue, messaged her almost immediately afterward asking if she had any more. Marlene sat with that message for a long while before responding. She thought about the finance company trucks. She thought about the bank. She thought about the empty barn and the silence that filled it now. And she thought, for the first time in months, that maybe there was a version of this story that didn't end with everything simply being gone. She started researching in earnest, staying up late with her laptop, the same way she used to stay up late poring over feed budgets and milk price reports. What she found surprised her. There was a real, sustained market for exactly the kind of object sitting untouched in her barn. Rustic home decor buyers who wanted authentic farmhouse pieces, not mass-produced imitations. Wedding and event planners who paid a premium for genuine, vintage dairy equipment to use as centerpieces and photo backdrops. Garden designers who converted old cans into planters. Interior decorators who turned them into side tables, lamp bases, and umbrella stands for boutique farmhouse-style homes. What struck her most was a pattern she kept encountering in her research. The objects that sold for the most weren't the ones in the best condition. They were the ones with the best stories. A pristine, machine-polished can, with no history, behind it might sell for the scrap adjacent price a dealer would offer, but a can with a documented past, a real farm, a real family, real decades of use, commanded 2, 3, sometimes 5 times as much. Because the buyer wasn't just purchasing a piece of stainless steel, they were purchasing a fragment of an American story they wanted to bring into their own home. That was the moment the real shift happened for Marlene. Not the first sale, though that mattered, but the realization of why it had sold. She wasn't sitting on 200 pieces of scrap metal. She was sitting on 200 fragments of a story that people, it turned out, were hungry to own a piece of. Realizing there was a market was one thing. Building a real business out of it was another matter entirely, and Marlene approached it the only way she knew how: methodically, and with the same stubborn persistence her grandfather had once applied to 60 acres of unforgiving hill country. She started by teaching herself proper metal restoration, watching hours of tutorials and, more usefully, reaching out directly to a retired metalworker to counties over, who agreed to let her spend a Saturday in his shop in exchange for helping him move some scrap. He taught her the basics of safe rust removal, how to seal metal against future corrosion without stripping away, the character that made each can unique, and how to tell, with a practiced eye, which dents told a good story, and which ones just needed to be worked out. She experimented with finishes. A matte clear coat preserved the raw, weathered look that farmhouse buyers loved most. For customers who wanted something bolder, she learned basic powder coating, sending pieces out to a local shop, until she'd saved enough to invest in small equipment of her own. She taught herself hand engraving well enough to personalize pieces. A family name, a wedding date, a set of coordinates marking a piece of land that mattered to someone. Each new skill expanded what she could charge, and more importantly, expanded what she could offer. Photography turned out to matter more than she expected. Her early listing photos, taken on her phone in dim barn light, undersold everything. She spent an afternoon researching how small sellers photographed vintage goods and realized the difference was almost entirely about light and context. Natural window light, a simple, neutral backdrop, and close-up shots that showed texture and craftsmanship instead of hiding it. Sales roughly doubled once she fixed her photos alone. Before she changed anything else about the product, she built a simple online shop, learning the platform through trial, error, and a fair amount of frustration. She figured out shipping, logistics through a series of expensive, early mistakes, a can that arrived dented from poor packaging, a shipping quote that ate her entire profit margin, until she found a better carrier rate for oversized items. Each mistake taught her something the last one hadn't, and she kept careful notes. The same instinct that had once filled the farm's ledgers now redirected toward building something new. Pricing was its own education. Her instinct, shaped by years of a dairy economy that punished her for asking for what her work was worth, was to underprice everything. Out of fear nobody would pay more, she forced herself to research comparable pieces, to account for the hours of labor in every restoration, and to price not just for the metal, but for the story attached to it. When she raised her prices on a batch of 10 cans by nearly 40%, sales didn't slow down, they picked up. The first sale had been one can, sold for $85 to a stranger decorating a wedding. Within 4 months, she was selling 10 a week. By the end of that first year, she'd sold nearly 200 restored pieces, every can that had once lined the wall of her silent barn, and had started sourcing more from neighboring farms that, like hers, had old dairy equipment gathering dust in barns nobody quite knew what to do with. What she came to understand, slowly, and then all at once, was that people weren't really buying metal, they were buying a connection to something real. A working farm, a family that had endured, an authenticity that mass-produced decor could imitate, but never quite replicate. Every listing she wrote leaned into that truth instead of away from it. She stopped describing her products in terms of dimensions and finish. She started describing them in terms of history. This can traveled the same gravel road for over 60 years, carrying milk from a small family dairy to a creamery 3 miles down the road, hand-restored, imperfections preserved, ready to carry a new story into your home. That was the lesson. Underneath everything else, she was learning about branding, photography, and pricing. People don't just buy objects, they buy meaning. And meaning, unlike milk, wasn't subject to a price formula set by distant boardrooms. It was hers to set. By the second year, what had started as a way to clear out a silent barn had become something Marlene could no longer describe as a side project. She'd registered a business name, Hutchins Homestead Co., and started thinking, not just about selling individual cans, but about building something that could stand on its own, the way the dairy once had. She introduced limited seasonal collections, restoring batches of cans with finishes tied to the time of year, warm copper-toned pieces for autumn, crisp whitewashed cans for spring weddings, deep matte black for a holiday collection that sold out within days of launching. She began offering personalization as a core part of the business rather than an occasional ad on engraved family names, anniversary dates, farm coordinates, turning what had been anonymous scrap into one-of-a-kind keepsakes that customers couldn't find anywhere else. Restaurants and cafes became a steady source of larger orders, buying multiple pieces at once for decor, the same kind of farmhouse aesthetic she'd first noticed in that Main Street cafe window that started the whole idea. Corporate clients began reaching out too, ordering custom engraved cans as client gifts or lobby decor for companies wanting to project a certain kind of heritage authenticity. A boutique hotel chain placed an order for 30 pieces to furnish a new property's lobby and rooms, the single largest order Marlene had filled to date, and one that made her sit down at the kitchen table afterward and actually cry, not from stress this time, but from something closer to relief. She leaned harder into storytelling as the business grew, rather than away from it, understanding by now that the story was the product as much as the metal was. Her website featured photos of the original barn, of her grandfather's initials, still faintly visible on one of the oldest cans, of the empty milking parlor where it had all begun again. She wrote about the morning the trucks came, not to dwell on the loss, but because customers responded to the honesty of it, to knowing that what they were buying had survived something real. Word of mouth did more for the business than any advertising she could have afforded. A wedding planner who'd bought a dozen cans for one event recommended Hutchins Homestead Co. to 3 other planners. A design blogger featured one of her restored pieces in a farmhouse decor roundup, and the traffic that followed crashed her website for the better part of a day. Social media, which she'd approached with real reluctance at first, became one of her most effective tools. Once she stopped trying to sell products in every post and started simply showing the process, the restoration work, the barn, the history, letting people fall in love with the story before she ever asked them to buy anything. She priced her premium pieces well above what a casual observer might expect, for what was, at its core, an old piece of farm equipment, and customers paid it without hesitation, because by then, they weren't buying a milk can, they were buying craftsmanship, scarcity, and a story that couldn't be replicated by any factory. A single restored, engraved piece from a limited collection could sell for what an entire pallet of scrap steel might once have fetched, and buyers considered it a bargain, because what they were purchasing didn't exist anywhere else in the world. By the end of the 3rd year, Hutchins Homestead Co. crossed 6 figures in annual revenue, a number that would have seemed impossible to Marlene, standing in that silent barn, hand on a dented can, with nothing but an idea and no customers at all. Somewhere in that growth, almost without her noticing, the exact moment it happened, the identity of the business shifted beneath her. She was no longer a dairy farmer trying to survive on the margins of a shrinking industry. She was the founder of a design brand rooted in agricultural heritage, a distinction that mattered less for what it sounded like on paper and more for what it meant in practice. She wasn't at the mercy of a milk price set by a distant formula anymore. She set her own prices, told her own story, and built something that couldn't be repossessed by a finance company because it didn't depend on equipment leases or commodity markets at all. It depended on her hands, her history, and her willingness to keep going after everything else had been taken. 4 years after the morning the trucks came to take everything, Marlene stood on the same gravel driveway, waiting for a truck of her own. The barn behind her didn't look like it had that first year of silence. The old milking parlor had been converted into a workshop, with a restoration station where the bulk tank used to sit, and shelves along the walls holding not scrap metal but finished pieces, some engraved and boxed for shipping, some staged for photography, a few reserved for a design magazine that had reached out the week before about featuring her story. The driveway itself, once the site of the worst morning of her life, had become something else entirely. Delivery trucks came up it now too, but not to take anything away. They came to collect outgoing orders, crates of restored milk cans bound for a hotel lobby in another state, a shipment of personalized anniversary pieces headed to a wedding venue 3 states over, a custom corporate order for a company that wanted a piece of authentic American agricultural history in their new headquarters lobby. She watched the driver back the truck up to the workshop door, the same stretch of gravel where, years earlier, she'd stood in disbelief, watching her bulk tank chained onto a flatbed. The symmetry wasn't lost on her. It never was, not on days like this. Big shipment today, the driver said, glancing at the stack of crates waiting near the door. Biggest one yet, Marlene said, and found she was smiling as she said it. Not the careful, guarded smile she'd worn through those first hard years of rebuilding, but something looser, something closer to the way she remembered smiling as a girl, sitting on an overturned bucket in a barn that used to hum with the sound of a working dairy. She thought, as she often did on mornings like this, about her grandfather's old saying, "You don't throw away where you came from, even when you've outgrown it," and understood now, in a way she hadn't fully understood as a child, exactly what he meant. She hadn't saved the dairy. The dairy, in the form her family had always known it, was gone, and she had made a kind of peace with that loss. That didn't require pretending it hadn't happened, but she hadn't thrown away where she came from either. She had found a way to carry it forward, one restored can at a time, into homes and cafes and hotel lobbies far beyond the boundaries of the 60 acres her grandparents had bought with a soldier's savings and a feed store paycheck in 1962. Years ago, trucks came up this driveway to erase her family's future. Today, trucks still arrive every morning, but instead of carrying away what little she had left, they carry a piece of her family's story into homes, cafes, hotels, and businesses across the country that value craftsmanship over scrap, meaning over metal, history, and the merely new. The dairy never truly disappeared. It simply found a new way to be remembered.